The Sunday Papers
on Off the Ball.
Welcome along, great to have you with us. Sunday Papers, Joe Molloy with you, so I'll run you through the front pages. First of all, I'll start with the Sunday Times main section front page. As has been the case over the last number of weeks, there is a reference to this GAA star fraud inquiry. So John Mooney and Bo Donnelly here on the front page of the Sunday Times. No evidence GAA star in fraud inquiry had cancer, say Gardaí. The piece says there's no evidence that the former GAA star, who claimed to have cancer as part of an alleged fraud and deception plot, has ever been diagnosed with the disease, security sources have told the Sunday Times. He is accused of obtaining at least $250,000 in gifts, loans from friends, acquaintances, business associates to pay for stem cell injections as part of his cancer treatment at a clinic in America. Gardaí say no evidence that the man was diagnosed with cancer. They do not believe he travelled to America for medical treatment. One source said it was all orchestrated. He deceived a lot of people to fund a lifestyle that was simply beyond his means. That's the front section of the Sunday Times main section. Sun Sport back page here is a picture of Arsenal's Zinchenko and Mikel Arteta dedicating their latest win to Zinchenko, his family and Ukraine. And then top of the back page of Sun Sport is James Lowe touching down Mamma Mia, Ireland 34, Italy 20. Andy Farrell, lots to work on after mother of all battles. Certainly the best Italy-Ireland game in decade anyway. Back page Mail on Sunday, they have celebrations. Craig Casey celebrating with Hugo Keenan after Keenan's try. Ireland's slam dream a step closer after exciting Italy run them close is the main lead there. And they have Raphael Varane as well, talking about the importance of Erik ten Hag and Manchester United winning a trophy. We have the Mirror. It's Fasnail's third win, top of that page. Andy Farrell insists his table-topping team must be more clinical. And then Dark Side of the Tune. This is Kieran Trippier, who was talking about the dark arts, and he takes a certain pride in them. The Sunday Times also have those Kieran Trippier quotes. Dark arts essential, says Trippier. So Newcastle have been accused of time wasting and game management, and Erik ten Hag has called those antics annoying. But Trippier, who was schooled by Diego Simeone, says he loves them. It's about when to slow down a game. He said, if the opposition are having more of the ball or on top, of course you're going to kill the game. You're not going to take a quick throw in and say carry on. Of course some teams won't like it, but it's about being clever in the moment. And he talked about Spain, and he said there was a lot of it there. I love it. He said the best for me was Stefan Savic of Atletico. He used to pull people's hair, even in training. It was crazy, honestly, but I loved it, said Kieran Trippier. And then the main picture is Hugo Keenan against Italy yesterday. Similar picture on the Sunday Independent. This time it's Mac Hansen diving over the line to score Ireland's fifth try. Hansen to the rescue. Ireland survives scare in Rome to keep Grand Slam dream alive. And they do note beneath the picture, Brendan Fanning does, that Tadhg Furlong is injured. He's missed all 3 rounds. And now Finlay Bealham has gone off with a twisted knee. So Ireland are getting into third and fourth man in that very crucial position. So we'll see what Bealham's fitness is like. It didn't look good, but we'll see what it's like ahead of Scotland. And there's no real word on Tadhg Furlong's return. I would say, and by the way, you're both very welcome. Shane Keegan, Cobh Ramblers manager. Hello.
How are you, Joe?
And Kieran Cunningham, Chief Sportwriter with the Irish Daily Star. I would say the general theme of the rugby coverage is Italy much, much better. Ireland did fine.
Yeah, as you say, it was one of the better Ireland-Italy games in a long, long time. But it probably wasn't a huge surprise because Italy had shown their other 2 games, that they have improved significantly and have been quite competitive in this Six Nations, even though, the end results have been, a couple of scores in the games. But you look at where Ireland are, and it's such a healthy situation to have 3 wins in a row, all with a bonus point win. A huge amount of players have got game time, even though there were significant. And there were players lost who haven't played at all, like Tadhg Furlong, who would have been seen as a huge loss. But others have stepped up, and there does seem to be genuine strength and depth in every position, bar maybe full back and loose head. And I think it's important, when you see every year you get the top 20 most viewed, a list of top 20 most viewed programmes on Irish television, and it's remarkable how high the Six Nations games are. Like, it is hugely popular, and that popularity is because it is significant, and people can get obsessed with the World Cup and go in Ireland's World Cup history. And of course, Ireland have never gone past a quarter final. And there's a very real chance they mightn't go past the quarter-final this year because the group is particularly hard. And then the quarter-final, you're likely facing the All Blacks or France on home soil, which would be a huge ask. With this current Ireland team, you would give them a decent chance. But a Grand Slam, they have a shot at a Grand Slam. And maybe a Grand Slam with a bonus point in every game, the way they're playing, which would be a massive achievement. And no matter what happens in the autumn, I think that would be a big deal. And it's important these couple of weeks should be enjoyed because they do seem to be a remarkable bunch and a hugely impressive coaching team headed by Andy Farrell now.
It's interesting, even Stuart Barnes, who had to sit through Wales-England, he said Cardiff felt like a throwback. At half-time, the man on the tannoy announced Wales 3, England 8 in a physical battle. He was right. Earlier in the afternoon, we witnessed Ireland and, to a lesser extent, Italy ripping each other's defences to pieces. In contrast, the first 40 minutes here was full of kicking, and not all of it especially tactical. So it does crystallise the fact that Ireland, France, and increasingly Italy are playing a lovely, expansive brand of rugby, and the rest are playing catch-up. So there's nothing wrong with enjoying it. We seem to fret what will happen at the World Cup at all times.
Yeah, and it's the same across.
Without winning the other.
Yeah, and it's the same across all sport. Like I was just saying to you before we came on about how great Mayo are to watch now. And Mayo mightn't win the All Ireland because Mayo generally don't win the All Ireland, but I still love watching them. Like, it's important to enjoy the journey as well. And ultimately, sport is about enjoyment. It's a pastime. It's a recreation for us. We want to enjoy it. We don't want to endure it.
Life is tough enough.
Yes, indeed.
My only input, unfortunately, Joe, in the conversation we were driving up along, and I had my wife and my young fella in the car, and I was saying to my wife, I'll be no addition now to the rugby talk, And Connor's sitting in the back, and he says, Dad, it's an awful pain that we're not very good at the sport the two of us love, and we seem to be very good at the one sport neither of us pay any interest in.
On Kieran Trippier, dark arts essential. Do Cobh Ramblers indulge? They do. Would you believe of their manager?
Would you believe, Joe? We had a game last Friday night, and we just scored a goal. And upon scoring the goal, I wanted to get a message out, so I let her roar at Jack Doherty, one of our attackers. I went down on one knee and I let her roar, "Your laces, Jack, your laces," And literally, as I was doing it, I looked up, and the fourth official was literally standing just over me, and he just looking down at me, shaking his head. At least do it out my eye line, Shane. But look, I think everybody does to a certain extent, to various different standards. I suppose I was interested to see who was the player they named who apparently has interfered with 2 attempts at quick throw-ins. I thought that was an interesting one. He was a substitute. One of the Newcastle players was a substitute on 2 occasions, and on both occasions, 2 separate matches, tried to interfere with somebody trying to take a quick throw-in. That's a new form of dark arts to me, all right. But I think you're naive if you're not involved in them in some capacity, all right.
I would think so. So let's jump into the papers then. Plenty of interesting talking points. Joe Brolly, I suspect this will be much discussed. Violent sports out of control. It's time to ban all of it. So he starts by mentioning the Power Slap League. Now, if you're on TikTok or Instagram Reels or any social media of that nature, you will have seen the Power Slap League pop up somewhere along the line. In effect, this is where you stand in front of your opponent with your hands by your side, and they get to slap you as hard as they can. And if you're not knocked out, then you slap them back, and on we go. And Joe Brolly says that the boundaries of legalised thuggery are disappearing fast. And he goes on to talk generally about things like the Power Slap League and MMA, UFC, and he said, in response to criticism of the brutality of this new sport, he's talking in this instance about Power Slap League, by many people, including prominent neurosurgeons who are criticising it. Dana White, their promoter, has become a billionaire on the back of legalised thuggery. I'm sure Dana White would disagree with that characterisation. He said that they need to get educated on the subject. Sniggering at reporters, he said, if you don't effing like it, don't effing watch it. Nobody's asking you to watch this. Oh, you're disgusted by it? Go watch The Voice. So Joe Brolly continues later on in the piece by saying, it's an animalistic dystopia where violence and rage have free reign, like soccer hooliganism or attacks on refugees or dogfighting or drug wars, with all the same inhumane language and thuggery. And he does acknowledge the point I suspect you would both make to me, which is something deep in us thrills to violence. He says by the end of the 19th century, public executions were the main spectator sport in England. The hanging of Henry Fauntleroy, a gentleman fraudster who was hanged at Newgate in 1824, drew a crowd of 100,000, and he wonders what the likes of Bob Arum might do with that. He also addresses the violent sports lobby, who will say the fighters want to do it. It's their escape from the ghetto. It's their means of expression. Brolly's response to that. This, of course, is true. It's equally true that many young men from ghettos around the world choose drug dealing and assassination of opponents as their escape from the ghetto and means of expression. If an entrepreneurial millionaire started Ultimate Combat, a sport where the fighters use knives to fight to the death, he would have a deluge of applicants. He says, why not legalise dogfighting? We can call it Ultimate Dogfighting Championship. We can have vets there and veterinary assistants. So Dana White could say, the primary concern of all of us at UDFC is the welfare of the animals. And Brolly concludes by saying, dehumanising people, watching their blood spill, watching them knocked unconscious, watching them attack each other with everything they have is thrilling. The audiences in ancient Rome went wild. Lynching, hanging, gentlemanly duels to the death, burning witches at the stake, and all the rest of it used to be commonplace. The reason laws were developed to stop all of this was to protect people against our base instincts, against our rages and violence and prejudices and murderous intents. A violent pro-sport is out of control. It is time to ban it all. Humans have to be protected from our worst selves, and it doesn't get much worse than this. Agree, disagree, somewhere in the middle?
Well, I'm all on board with Joe's take on it, to be honest with you, Joe. I've never watched a UFC fight. It's just not my cup of tea. Absolutely not my cup of tea.
Someone is going to reply straight away, how can you ban something you've never seen?
Because it, like you made the comment, I suppose, about the slapping or the World Slapping Championships or whatever it's called, pops up on my timeline. It pops out UFC highlights, and people, you know, obviously the bits that will be go up online will be I understand that they'll be the most extreme clips, so they will, but
No, that's fair enough. So you have seen it then?
I've seen it, yeah. I've never sat down to watch a UFC fight and seen a UFC fight from start to finish. Have I seen what goes on inside the cage? Of course I have. I think you couldn't live on this planet without seeing it. It's become so huge, and it is huge, absolutely huge, and I have no doubt that I'll suffer the wrath of those that are very, very much into it with my take on it. But I'm just giving my opinion. I'm just, I don't know, maybe I'm soft. I'm just not able for that kind of violence. It turns my stomach. Even when the clips come on my timeline, turns my stomach, and I'd scroll past it very, very quickly. Yeah, it's and yet, so this is where, you know, the hypocrite is. I have absolutely no problem with boxing, but I would see them as very, very, very different. And maybe that's me drawing a rule to suit my own narrative, but I would see them as very, very different. I see the skill, I see the purism in boxing to a certain extent, without being an expert on boxing by any stretch of the imagination. But this, like UFC, to me is just savagery. It's.
And where are you on boxing when it's a particularly savage fight and there's blood being spilled and there are knockouts?
I don't think it happens that often, I suppose, for a start. Again, I would be jump on board, jump off board when it would come to boxing. I wouldn't have to say the breadth and knowledge that Kieran would have on it for sure, but I would regard the Katie Taylor fight as my sporting highlight of last year. I thought that was absolutely superb occasion, and there's, you know, plenty more that go alongside it. Would I turn away if one person was just blatantly hammering the head off somebody else? Yeah, again, I might have to flick the channel, and again, my stomach is kind of reasonably weak in that sense, I suppose. But a proper, I could take a proper boxing match between two people. I don't see any circumstances in which I would take a huge amount of enjoyment, or any form of enjoyment, or even be able to stomach a UFC fight, to be honest with you.
Yeah, Joe has written about boxing before, and he's made the same arguments about boxing. Like, and he would have had a graw for boxing. Like Paul McCloskey from Dungiven, where Joe was from, was a top professional. He used to go to a lot of his fights, but he makes the same arguments about about the dangers of it, and what kind of primal savagery within us are we satisfying by watching boxing. And I increasingly have a more troubled relationship with boxing than I used to, because of various reasons. But I think it's easy to sentimentalise boxing, and because of its history, because of the people involved, because of the great help it's been to so many people. And over the years, like, many of the best people and the most interesting people I've met in sport have been boxers or boxing trainers. I'm sure you're the same, Joe, like some of the interviews you've had in here with them. But also in the last few years, especially, some of the worst people I've come across in sport have been in boxing. Really people who with zero morals, concern related to anything. And it does say, like, just on boxing, like, there is a specific form of dementia, pugilistic dementia, that is related to boxing. That shows the dangers of it. Even when you get away from this. Now, Dana White, to me, has not been a positive force in the world of sport. Like, he's made a lot of money. He's grown a sport from fairly humble origins to becoming a massive cash cow and becoming hugely popular. But where does this end? I don't think this will end with a power slap league. Like, the UFC was developed, it got to a certain extent, so we come up with a power slap league. Like, what's next? Will he have something where people have to take a body shot in the guts, unguarded? Like he seems to be looking for the more visceral thrill. They're looking for the TikTok moment. There's something that can go viral in 3 or 4 seconds, and the slaps and somebody falling to the ground gives them that. You get that in the knockout in boxing, but you'll watch a lot of 10-round fights and you won't get a knockout. But this is all just about that quick fix, and it is dangerous. And as Joe says, there were so many things in the past. Like, you get this in boxing, like so many people say, the mafia used to run boxing or whatever, so why do you bring up Daniel Cunningham or whatever, like something like that. But there were so many things that were acceptable in the past that aren't acceptable now.
Yeah.
And this does seem, this is going back to Rome and the Colosseum and gladiators. And I can't see it in any way being a healthy development for sport.
Mm. Yeah. What about the argument that if you ban all of this, it becomes unregulated, underground, and a million times worse in all sorts of grisly ways?
That is a strong argument, but there's an argument as well that MMA still hasn't been recognised by Sport Ireland, and that, it's been around quite a long time now. I know there have been moves made, but even up till relatively recently, the MMA supposed governing body's website here was just a Facebook page. So there was a shoddiness in around the sport, despite its popularity, despite the increasing number of people take part in it. Like, I think you had a Bellator event in Dublin last night, didn't you? It was last night. Yeah, and which gets huge crowds. So it is, even without McGregor competing really in a long time, it's still massively popular, and you are seen as a dinosaur if you don't get it. You do get told to educate yourself, and as compared to human chess, etc. But I think you have to trust your own eyes and your own judgment at times, and it's not for me, definitely, and the power slap isn't for me, and I'm very worried about what they're going to throw up next as the supposed future of combat sports. And I'm not sure about banning anything. I think banning can be counterproductive. Yeah.
It's feeding a massive appetite. Like, it's feeding an absolutely massive appetite. Like, the same clip that will come up on my feed that I will wince at or pull away from or scroll past if I can figure will have a couple of 100,000 likes, like a couple of 100,000, And I suppose the other thing, if I'm honest as well, the other thing that probably does colour my view on it all as well is just my own personal distaste for McGregor, and then that leads me to disliking what he's involved in, I think, as well. So I think that colours my view on it as well,
Yeah. Again, I'm not sure about banning any of these things. Regulate them better, for sure. The one thing I find objectionable about the pro MMA lobby is that line about educate yourself. It's just nonsensical. There's no education required. We can all appreciate the athletic prowess required, the physical training required, the judgment of timing and space, and the whole array. You could talk boxing. I mean, throw in several other pursuits. You can educate yourself. That takes about a minute to appreciate. You can also look at an image of someone prone on the ground, being punched repeatedly in the head, blood flying, referee not stepping in for a considerable period of time, and you can find that objectionable. I mean, I think the educate yourself argument. I mean, the mafia's best sniper, brilliant marksman from 200 yards away. And it's like, educate yourself. I'm really good at this, you know. So I've always found you just need to educate yourself, and then you'll understand and appreciate the sport line. That's ridiculous, frankly. It's because you were apologetic, Shane, when you began by saying, I don't like this, as if I'm about to face the wrath. You're perfectly entitled to say, I've seen it. It's way too violent for me. The education is not going to change that.
And Joe Brawley references the fight between two women, Michelle Watterson and Justine Kish, and that Felice Herrig made Justine Kish soil herself, or she soiled herself in a fight against the Octagon. And this has been mentioned in commentary since, that she has actually made somebody shot themselves. And that's and that this, and you go like that's. I don't know what to say about that. Like that's not where the way. That's nothing to do with sport to me. I also just don't believe that supposed primal instinct for some sort of thrill that we get from a violent moment. I don't think that is inherent in everybody. I definitely don't. I think, a lot of the people who are hitting when they see somebody getting the head hammered off them in a cage is the same person who hits when they see a clip of somebody getting knocked out outside a nightclub, on CCTV, kind of, these clips that we see going around, And I think they are sports for an age where, especially so many young men have gravitated towards somebody like Andrew Tate and the kind of stuff that he's been expounding about what men should do and what an alpha male is, and supposedly an alpha male is something you aspire to, and that there's, there seems to be kind of a lot of young men that are quite lost, and they're latching on to these kind of men as role models, and they're not always role models. We've heard and read so much about Conor McGregor over the last few years, and there were people saying he was the greatest sports person ever to come out of Ireland. And when you hear a lot of the stuff you hear around him, I wouldn't be using the word great, and that's. I hope it's a bit of collective madness that a lot of people in a couple of years might look back on this and think, how the hell did we latch ourselves onto this, or get so drawn into this that it should have been beyond the pale. But I know a lot of people listening to this will say we're sanctimonious and we're out of touch, but I don't care. I actually looked at Andrew Tate's Twitter feed last night, and I was looking at some of the people who follow him, and very prominent people in sport, and you go, why are they following him? I don't know. What are you getting out of that? I don't want to name them, but you're going.
Well, a follow's not always an endorsement.
It's not always an endorsement, but when somebody is coming out with a lot of vile stuff consistently, I'd wonder why you follow somebody. I wonder.
The only one other thought that did come into my head on it is, given that it's Joe that is writing it, I'm pretty sure I have read a couple of Joe pieces where the gist of the story at times can be, wasn't it hilarious today, my friend who was playing full back, your man got a point off him early, so he levelled him with a box and left him on the flat of his back, and God, he didn't score after that, kind of a thing. And I'm kind of thinking, how does that sit with this take as well, Joe?
I think, to be fair, where MMA would have a very fair argument is that boxing is completely, as you said, romanticised in the wider press, and MMA is criticised.
Yeah.
Now, there's probably more violence in MMA, I would say, but still, It's a fair enough point to make.
Yeah, well, like Bob Dylan has written 2 songs about boxers, The Hurricane and Who Killed Davy Moore. Martin Scorsese, John Huston, Jim Shard. So many film directors made films about boxers. Joyce Carlos has written about boxing. Some of the greatest, Ernest Hemingway, some of the greatest writers written about boxing. So there's all this history of major cultural figures that have embraced boxing. And that does give it a bit of weight and a bit of heft that MMA doesn't have. Like MMA is seen as an outlaw sport. And I think it likes that image. I think that does appeal to people.
That's Joe Brawley in the Sunday Independent. Let's turn to savagery of a different kind, being a GAA referee. Dermot Crowe writes this piece in the Sunday Independent as well. Thankless task, running out of takers. So the point to make here, so his jumping off moment is last week's game at Porky Queeve, where Seamus Mulhare sent off 2 players. They were very mild offences. He was criticised. They were bad red cards, but absolutely. I actually think in some instances it's such an easy thing for pundits to latch onto who have very little to say.
Nice easy talking point.
Well, it's like, we talk about red cards, bam, done, perfect, as opposed to tell me more about the trends in the game. And it's such an easy go-to piñata. And I think that happened to Seamus Mulhare. Like, it wasn't the end of the world. It was a league game. But he got a good kicking, and that was his biggest game of his career. Nobody made that allowance for him. First time on TV, Cork, Dublin, etc. Made a mistake. However, the issue at a local level is grave enough. So there are calls out all over the country for referees. Last weekend in Dublin, teams were notified by email that there could be a shortage of neutral referees for the opening round of Football League matches. Clubs were told they might have to make their own arrangements, agree a compromise referee, visiting teams to have first call. It was short on specifics as to who the referee might be. Could anyone stand in? If stuck, provided both agreed, was a question they had. And the issue is that there have been some extra referees coming to the game, but between juvenile games and ladies' matches, the number of games have shot up. So it's a net loss. Wexford chairman said there's a crisis point. Abuse is obviously probably the biggest issue in the game for referees. One referee in Dublin reckons it's also worsened since COVID. People appear less patient, more irascible. You'd be going home and going to bed, and it would play in your mind about what had happened that day. And he gives a few examples, and he says, you'd ask yourself, what the F am I doing this for? Interestingly, Kieran and I both remarked on this. I didn't realise the referees get the same €40 for refereeing an under-14 game as an adult match between 2 rivals with a history of splenetic behaviour. Why would you bother being a hero? And so the referee says, you just say, I'm working late or not available, and then you do he mentions adults men's football is just a no-go area for him, whereas ladies match, there's no abuse, interestingly. So that's the gist. I mean, the 2 careers where people say, why would you go into that? You'd be mad, are politics and being a referee.
Well, I think anyone who read this and who was thinking of becoming a referee would have second thoughts. No, and I can see why.
Didn't sound like a man happy in his job there. That
no, I can see why, because you just it's interesting because my wife has a job where she deals with the public, and she was saying that as well. Since COVID, people have been very harder to deal with. She would be making a lot of cold calls to people about various things, and that people are more irritable or more easily wound up, or
I think I am
a bit on edge. Yeah,
I genuinely do.
Yeah,
to catch myself in the car getting angry at people, because I think the standard of driving is, again, such an anecdotal, unprovable
but
thing.
I think you've kind of seen that in the way people have latched on to protests about various things, and they were kind of fired up after COVID, and then they've used that, they poured that anger into other things since COVID, and I think definitely fuses seems to have got a bit shorter, and like this, it's something that I've always tried to bite my tongue about. Like, even going to a game as a supporter of a local club or something, no matter what game, you're walking out and you hear people giving out about the referee. No matter what the referee has done, that there's just some people that latch on to blame the referee for anything that goes on. And it's funny, Dermot mentions his refereeing an underage game, and I refereed one game ever as well, and it was an underage, and I stepped in, and it was a lower grade, and but like it just actually hits you that is really hard. In that, because there's so many people running around and things are happening behind you and beside you, and you have literally a split second. Like you don't, like I think there's a reference there to Brian Clough and John Motson at the start. And Brian Clough saying, the referee has 5 seconds to make a decision. He does not. Like it's a second, really. Like I think they'd be delighted at 5 seconds.
And Clough in that clip was actually criticising Motson, saying, "You guys, what you do to referees is criminal."
Yeah, because the scrutiny, like it's. Like so many of the games, say you watch on Sky in soccer or Premier League games, half time is taken up with, was this a penalty? Was this a penalty? Was this a penalty? And scrutinising the officials. So it's just embedded in the culture that you question the officials all the time. And questioning VRs, question referees as well. They're all referees. So they're all making they're under the microscope constantly. Like there's been no allowance made in GAA for how fast the game has got compared to even 10, 15 years ago, that you still have one man trying to keep track of everything, even though there's far more subs now. There's rule changes that make it more difficult in terms of keeping track of black cards and sin bins, etc. And more, there's more pressure and more scrutiny. Like there's far more games. Like there used to be, like I think last weekend or this, I checked. I think there were about 8 or 9 live games on TV in the league last weekend. And like there was a time over the entire league, 8 games wouldn't be televised. Yeah. So you're under immense scrutiny. And then at the lower levels then, where there's not as much scrutiny, but because of that, you can be very isolated. Like you're just there, maybe hardly any spectators, just 2 teams, and you make a call and you have an angry sideline and angry players crowding around you, and that's how things happen so often.
First thing, I think it's a really, really well put together piece by Dermot. I think he's brought us inside very, very, very well. I would be on both sides of the coin in that, because I suppose attend so many different sporting events, even at grassroots and that, and locally it'll be they're changes into the soccer, into the hurling or whatever. You get roped in to referee games quite a lot when there isn't formal refereeing, and even when with my own young fellas age groups, 7s, 8s, there isn't proper referees, so you ref within the game, just the coaches referee the games. Now, like it just gives you a whole different perspective, and yet that whole different perspective still goes out the window when I get angry when I'm the manager on the sideline at a referee. I don't think back to the fact that I didn't like it when people were shouting at me when I was refereeing the under-8 game last Saturday when my referee makes a mistake in the League of Ireland on Friday night. So it doesn't serve any end. Look, it can be funny at times. I was refereeing my own young lads game last weekend, and I can tell you 100% that I had my father shouting at me for not giving my son enough frees. We all just become ridiculous on sidelines, and that's how we do. But like, it doesn't matter. Like, I suppose the point here is, I would have managed in the Laois Hurling Championship, right? I would have managed in the League of Ireland, and I will turn on and watch a Premier League game, and at all 3 levels I will have found myself at some stage saying standard refereeing is really deteriorating. So it's gone back. Standard refereeing in the Laois Senior Hurling Championship is just not good. Standard refereeing in the League of Ireland is just not good. Standard refereeing in the Premier League is just not good. Could it be because it's so bloody hard? It's mission impossible.
Because actually,
how do you make it better?
Yeah, it's a fair point. But I just remembered something about a senior club game, a senior club Gaelic football game in Donegal a good few years ago, and I was there with my own club. But they'd often, at that level, you'd often a linesman would be from each club and umpires from each club. And I was told, okay, you do linesman. I remember there was a blatant line ball that went off one of the players from my own club. So I gave it the right decision. And I got, some of the players from my own club that you were looking, because it was just accepted that you gave the biased decision. Yeah. That you go with them. So you have that. Referees have to factor that in as well, that they're dealing with often sideline officials who are from the clubs who are not necessarily acting in a neutral capacity. So.
You and Joe, we had obviously at the moment my day job, let's say, is I work in the Laois Coaching and Games department, and part of the remit within the Coaching and Games departments is the training and recruitment of referees. So last week we were to have what's called a young whistlers course, where you bring in kind of teenage kids and you train them up on refereeing. And in my head I was thinking, what a great way for them to earn a few. Like I think they get 20 quid a game or 10 quid a game or something like that. And I was thinking, that's great. If I was a young teenager now, I'd be thinking deadly, and we had to call off the course. There wasn't enough sign-ups.
Inflation. 20 quid. No thanks. Just to mention a few other pieces briefly, not so much talking points in the same way as those two previous topics, but to give you a flavour of what's in the papers. Paul Rowan has reached out to the legal advisor of Vera Pauw. So he's based in Iowa. Thomas Newkirk is his name. She had mentioned him in a recent press conference, and so he reached out just to get a sense of what he was thinking. A very good idea. He's represented more than 200 female coaches sanctioned or dismissed from their jobs in the US. Was approached by Pauw after she was accused in that official report of body shaming players at Houston Dash. Pauw denies the comments, and the point is made in the piece that the dispute is in danger of overshadowing Ireland's friendlies against the US in Texas and Missouri in early April. Question marks as to what kind of reception Pauw will receive. So Newkirk, this legal advisor, highly critical of how the National Women's Soccer League went about commissioning the report. He says they applied a trauma-centred approach to the investigations, which meant they evaluated the victims as if they were telling the truth first, and almost required the person accused to prove themselves not guilty. He says, of the 220 coaches I've identified, Vera's the one of the few who still has a job. If they're fired, they're done. In the US, their careers are destroyed. And obviously, as mentioned previously, if Vera Pauw is trying to get a job in the States, her status at the moment is conditional in the eyes of the league. And he goes through the various accusations against her. For instance, he says, who cares if somebody says don't eat fruit, is one of his points. Let's say it's true. Who cares? So I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. He's trying to sort that out away from the courts, but there's still potentially that option there. They may go the route of litigation. So that is ongoing. That is hanging over the situation and those games in April. FAI, as we know, came out the day the report was published and absolutely backed Vera Pauw, and didn't look into the matter further before releasing that statement, which was very striking, I thought. But that's going on page 13 of the Sunday Times. Paul Kimmage, page 7 of the Sunday Independent. He's certainly punted up to horse racing for the last year plus. And the focus of his attention here is the IHRB, the Irish Horse Racing Regulatory Board. Lynn Hillier is the head of that board. He's returning to that theme that Stephen Mahon was treated differently to Homer Scott. Stephen Mahon, who's blown the whistle on horse racing, banned for various issues regarding welfare. Paul Kimmage says there are differences with how he was treated and how Homer Scott was treated. But the key point of Lynn Hillier is, when is she going to answer some questions? He references that they had an encounter before and there was the promise of an interview and it hasn't happened. I think maybe at this stage, these pieces in the Sunday Independent have been lengthy and capturing the eye of the public, I think, for the last number of months. You kind of think, well, okay, Lynn Hillier should sit down with Paul Kimmage at this stage.
Yeah,
Why not?
I think so. I think I would guess that's the thinking behind Paul writing this, because it's repeating a lot of the stuff that's he's made points he's made before, but just to put the pressure on, and he's pointing out how many interviews she did a few years ago, and now there seems to be a fair amount of silence from that corner, and also. Just having a quick look around, like I wouldn't be a big into racing or have much knowledge about racing, but having a look at, say, what the podcasts or the, bar a couple of notable exceptions, like Richard Forrestal is one, I think, but very few in racing have followed up what Paul has done, and some of the racing media, using media in a with broad brushstrokes in this context, has been very negative towards Paul and very insulting towards Paul, and just dismissing what he said out of hand. So I don't think that's good enough either. And racing is funny actually, because in this weekend I was thinking about, because Newcastle United in the Carabao Cup final, and obviously the Saudi Arabia links. you have this fight, which in boxing between Jake Paul and Tommy Fury, which is taking part in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And there's huge hype around it. A lot of people within boxing questioning whether it's a real fight and whether it should actually be taking place. But also yesterday you had the Saudi Cup in racing, which is one of the richest races in the world. And you look at the scrutiny over boxing going to Saudi Arabia, Newcastle's links to Saudi Arabia, Live Golf connection to Saudi Arabia. And the sport with the deepest links to Saudi Arabia going back a long time is horse racing. And it does seem to get off scot-free. And that this seems to be an issue with racing in different contexts, that it gets a free pass that other sports don't get.
Okay. Michael Foley's written two pieces. We picked out one on Jarlath Burns, but there's one on trans rules in ladies Gaelic football on the bottom of page 19, which is a really good summation of what's going on in GAA if you're curious, because I just wasn't sure where this sport was on this issue. Obviously the IRFU followed the advice of World Rugby in effectively banning trans women from playing rugby. So the LGFA, it seems, caught everybody on the hop here. So I didn't understand the context, or I wasn't aware of the context. In effect, the LGFA made their announcement, which we'll come to in a moment, but put out their policy. And as Michael Foley writes, the phones at Croke Park and the offices of the GPA started hopping with difficult questions, but they had no answers. The LGFA had moved unilaterally, without a word to anyone. Not the GAA, not the GPA, not the Camogie Association. To make things more awkward, he says, they haven't offered any insight into the logic and science behind the rule. So those organisations, the GAA, the Camogie Association, they had thought that they were all moving together in lockstep on this one. The LGFA is part of a working group, which includes the GAA, the Camogie Association and other sporting authorities. And so what had happened is that Sport Ireland was undertaking similar work, and when that became apparent, the three organisations said, "Oh well, we'll put a pause in our working group and let's wait and see what Sport Ireland suggest, and we'll go from there." But Michael Foley says events overtook events. Last August, the LGFA, the Ladies Gaelic Football Association, had to deal with a dispute over the eligibility of a trans woman who lined out in a club game in Dublin, and so the new LGFA rule now allows transgender girls between 12 and 15 to play ladies football. That's subject to approval by the LGFA's Transgender Application Committee. If you're over 16, you'll only be allowed to compete if you can provide medical records showing testosterone levels in the previous year are less or equal to 10 nanomoles per litre of blood. And that policy will be reviewed every 3 years. Now, Michael points out in his piece, for now, we're talking about small numbers here. In ladies football and camogie, 6 players of the entire playing population are in this bracket. As for that Sport Ireland work, which is, as he says, been slow and painstaking, their final conclusions are expected by most stakeholders to leave responsibility for transgender policy with each individual sporting organisation. And that, to be fair, is what the Olympics have done. They've said to each organisation, you figure out your own policy. And so Michael sums up the various issues here. In particular, the scientific one being that this testosterone levels science, it just doesn't address the residual benefits of full male puberty, which are significant. And so the idea that testosterone is some kind of panacea and that there is a neat solution out there is just not true. We've had conversations on this show, Ross Tucker and others, and he is adamant that testosterone levels, is but a fraction of the scientific solution here. And so that's where the LGFA are, and it's case by case basis, but ultimately the testosterone solution is the one they've gone for, and GAA and Camogie Association are thinking, okay, I'm not sure what we do in the short term. So this is a difficult issue. This is going to be a big issue for the next number of decades.
It is. It's a very calm and measured piece by Michael Foley, and you need to be calm and measured with this issue because there's a lot of hysteria around it, and it's been weaponized by people for their own ends. I read a very good book recently called American Psychosis by David Cord of the New York Times, and it looked at It looks at the history of the creation of moral panics by factions of the Republican Party in America over the last 150 years. Things like Joe McCarthy and the Reds under the bed scares in the 1950s, the rise of the Tea Party, the various evangelical figures who became huge in the 80s, etc. But one thing that became clear reading that book is that the American right latched on to the trans issue about 25 years ago, and have created so much scaremongering about it, and they used the same kind of dehumanising language that they used about gay people before that. And this is incredibly complex. And I know I've taken a bit of heat before by just saying that I'm just in favour of trans women taking over women's sport, and it's not. That's not the case. What I would say is that it's very, very difficult, and I have no solution, because most people look at it in either two ways. They look at it as a sporting issue or a human rights issue, and it's very hard to find the point where you can keep both sides happy. Michael hints at that. He said the objection for any sports organisation dealing with this issue boils down to finding that tricky point in the graph where inclusiveness, fairness and safety all intersect. And I think Sport Ireland are right in this, in letting individual organisations make their own ruling on it, because sports are so different. Like a contact sport, clearly, if you have advantages from male puberty, it's more of an advantage in a contact sport than it would be in, say, badminton. That there are other sports, it wouldn't be such a factor, or snooker or whatever. But there's also, I'm very aware of the lack of trans voices in this debate. Because a couple of media outlets covered this week, and I heard them getting praised. People have been ignoring that, and you've covered it. But they had women on, as right woman would be, because it's obviously a huge issue if you're involved in women's sport, but it's also a huge issue if you're a trans person. And very few people are approaching trans people and seeing where they're coming from. And you see this now, like a trans community do feel under siege. Like you see what's happened with Wilson Hospital School and Enoch Burke, and how that, the poor kid at the centre of that, something that's making global headlines, what they must feel like. Excuse me, I don't want, I have to be a bit careful about this because I don't want to identify anybody, but I know of someone, a trans woman, excuse me, but she, when she was going through transition, she was referred to a psychologist. And after a while, the psychologist started using language that troubled her, because it was all bringing in hell and damnation, etc. And when she left that psychologist, she did a bit of research into the guy she'd met, that psychologist, and who he is and his background. And it turned out he's a member of Opus Dei. And why she was referred to somebody and why he's dealing with people going through transition is incredible. And if you think, that this moral hysteria, this moral panic about trans people has been stoked up again and again. And you think back 25 years ago, Hayley Cropper was a trans character, was introduced to Coronation Street as a trans character, and there was very little comment on it. In the 1970s and 1980s, Jan Morris, a trans woman, was a prominent writer and broadcaster on the BBC, and there was very little comment on it. So you go back 25, 40, 50 years ago, people got on with it and didn't think it was as much, but now it's become very much a hot issue, and an issue that has no easy solutions, and people are trying to find a way. As you say, it's right that Sport Ireland have been slow and laborious in this, because if you make a knee-jerk decision on this, I think you're in very problematic territory.
And in that sense, Kieran, why have the LGFA gone on a solo run here? Surely it's the safety in numbers.
Yeah, it says here they had to deal with an issue in a club game in Dublin. They had to.
Yeah, I remember that hitting the headlines
on that. Yeah. And so that almost, they feel forced their hand, and they had to come up with a solution sooner rather than later. I mean, I do think it is poor in the extreme that they're not explaining their decision, how they reached their decision, talking to the media at length, how they presented the decision. Like, you do have to point out that the International Olympic Committee of the testosterone solution said those rules are not fit for purpose. So I think the LGFA, if they're going to come out and make this ruling, they have to explain it. They can't just say, this is our position, we're not going to detail, it's very complicated, we're not going to detail how we reached this position. I think that's poor. Now, look, maybe it's a smaller organisation. I'm sure the media backlash is a scary prospect, and they're trying to come away from it. I would have said the IRFU, when they made their judgment and along World Rugby lines, they weren't forthcoming with the media either.
Yeah.
I remember that week where, can you please come on and let's discuss this? And not, if we say nothing for a week, it all goes away, and it does all go away.
Yeah.
So that's not great, and the LGFA probably should be more proactive in their public dealings on this issue. But that's the reason they've not jumped the gun, but they've been forced to move more quickly.
Yeah, like even to say that the policy will be reviewed every 3 years. Like 3 years seems a long time in an area that there are, you know, pretty rapid developments in at the moment. It's I don't know. I just think they could have rode in with everybody else a little bit more and got every, you know, I know it's very, very hard to get consensus here, but I understand the player last year and that bringing it to light, but I just find it very strange that they've gone the solo run here. It's definitely drawn attention.
It has. Maybe you could say that's brave on their part to take a stance and make a move for their members that they feel is right. That's the other side of that coin, to be fair to them. But,
if they've come up with a measurement or a solution that we're all going, that seems bang on, but they've come up with a solution that, as you've stated, has already been written off as adequate.
Well, see, this is and it's so complicated.
I know there is no solution. There is.
From a scientific point of view, if you had Ross Tucker on, he would say it's inadequate.
Yeah.
That testosterone that's inadequate. Like, I mean, you've a 6'4", 28-year-old male, strong, healthy, transitions a year of lower testosterone. A lot of those residual benefits stay, and that's where the safety issue comes in. But as Kieran says, then you take if you take a wider step, what is sport philosophically, and where do human rights come into it? Where does social inclusion come into it? What outweighs the other? And IRFU and rugby have said, well, safety is paramount. LGFA have pitched it at a more inclusive level here, and they're probably going to see how that goes.
And also, some of the loudest voices in this, it's pretty clear they don't believe trans is a real thing. Whereas, as scientists and psychologists, etc., do accept, and the law of the land in Ireland now accepts that, you can be born, a woman can be born into a man's body, and that it's a right and it's a legitimate thing to transition, and that that there's a history there that shows, this isn't an affectation or something like that. This is something real. But I think there's people who keep pushing it. The opposite, and who refuse to accept that a trans woman is a woman, for example, whereas, the law of the land says that is the case. Mm.
It's on page 19 of the Sunday Times. We're going to be talking about this for months and years ahead. I think probably a sport by sport decision is how this is going to go. And it's those semi-physical sports that will be the trickiest areas to navigate, You, Shane, picked out a short piece Michael Dignan had written on hurling promotion in the country. Yeah,
and I suppose, to be honest with you, the reason it caught my eye was because of the Liam Griffin piece with yourselves during the week. So there was a motion, let me get the exact nature of it. There was a motion taken to Congress during the week to make dual from 7 to 10, is it, compulsory across the club, or across the country. So I'll get the exact phrase of it here. Yeah, it was his own club, St Mary's in Rossmore, aimed at protecting hurling as part of our heritage and culture, developing dual nurseries so that clubs would have to introduce hurling as well as football from under 7 to under 10 level where Go games are played. Coming from the position that I'm coming from, I thought that would have been an absolutely fantastic measure. At the same time, does it surprise me that it didn't get voted through? Probably not. I'm the Games Promotions Officer with Portlaoise GAA Club. Over the last 10 to 15 years, I suppose thereabouts, Portlaoise as a football club, they had a huge amount of success, I suppose, for a 10-year period. Not so much success at the moment. It's dropped off a bit now, all right. But during that period of time, Portlaoise hurling, they dropped formerly, a team that would have been competing for championships very, very much in the 80s and 90s, aren't even competing at senior level at the moment anymore. Which given the population of Portlaoise, really isn't justifiable. Now, there's huge measures been taken in Portlaoise GAA Club to try and rectify that. And we have done exactly this. We have made it compulsory from under 7 to under 10 that all teams are dual. And we're already seeing the benefits of it, I think, and we'll certainly see the benefits of it going forward.
When you say all teams are dual, do you mean like an under 10s football team now split their time between football and hurling?
Exactly. That's
so
exactly
on
what I mean.
Tuesday we're going to practice football, and on Thursday's training, here are your hurls.
Now, it becomes more nuanced than that, Joe, because if we say that, then they will choose which ones they will turn up to. If they like football but aren't particularly into hurling, they might appear at Tuesday's training session but not appear at Thursdays. So the only way to get around that is that all sessions are half and half.
Are there any 7-year-olds going down with a hamstring?
No, not really. No,
That's interesting.
Yeah, and that was the only way to try and get around it. And there's no doubt, the argument will be, well, you can't force an 8-year-old who doesn't want to play camogie if she only wants to play football. Well, we kind of have to try and force. Her because
and walk the line though of not resulting in dropout.
Absolutely. And you can't, when I say try and force her, obviously you're not going to get into a row and all that. And if
you haven't hit children with hurls, is that what you're telling me?
No, exactly. There's nobody roaring and shouting at them and telling them they absolutely have to, but they are very, very, very much encouraged, because you could have a 7-year-old girl or 7-year-old boy who, looking at the game of hurling, because it is quite physical and you will get a belt and you probably will get hurt. Chances of somebody going down crying in our hurling training sessions compared to our football training sessions is tenfold, obviously, and therefore it's understandable that there might be a little bit of a fear factor around it. But if you teach them the basic skills properly and teach them how to block properly and teach them how to protect themselves properly, I have seen plenty of cases of somebody who, if they were given the choice, wouldn't have played hurling at all. 12 months later, they are flourishing and they're loving it. And that's brilliant to see. Absolutely brilliant to see. Now,
how commonplace do you think that is across clubs?
Trying to impose dual? Yeah. There wouldn't be too many dual clubs in Laois. You could count on one hand how many dual clubs there would be in Laois. Laois is very, very particular geography. You take Portlaoise has been the centre of Laois. Everything to the west of Portlaoise is hurling. Everything to the east of Portlaoise is football. That makes sense. Kilkenny's to the west, Kildare and Dublin are to the east, and that's how it breaks up. Now you do have, because I go into schools and do a huge amount of coaching, and there is an awful lot of logistics around it. Like, I arrive into a school to do a Gaelic football training session.
Easy.
Couple of bibs, football, let's go. Whereas, there's a massive multinational base in Portlaoise at the moment, where a lot of these kids, may never have seen a game of hurling in their life before, never mind own their own helmet or own their own hurl. So when I'm arriving at school to do hurling, we got to the stage where, well, there's no point in saying whoever has a helmet can play hurling, because we'll have almost nobody. So I arrive in with 2 bags full. I have about 30 helmets arriving into the school, because it's the only way to get around that problem, and another bag full of hurls in various different sizes. But when you do go the extra length to try and make it possible, it's amazing how much they love it. It's absolutely amazing how much they love it.
Interesting. Kieran, I would put it to you, and the GAA could be the greatest sporting organisation on the planet. And there's a real argument. Its great failing is that hurling is still played in so few counties at such a high level.
Yeah. Well, I think without a doubt it is great failing. Like, at a serious level, it's barely a quarter of the counties. So, that's in a very small island.
Do you anticipate that changing?
Very gradually, very slowly, because there has to be will. And there's also an expense, because to get to the level, say like a Donegal or a Mayo, or like a Division 1 counties that are consistently Division 1 in football, to get to a competitive level in hurl or football costs a fair amount of money. So they would have to match that investment and probably go beyond it to get much more competitive in hurling. And there's, as things stand, counties are having a lot of trouble with finance at the moment. But just from what Shane was saying there, like my own experience in Dublin, just taking the young fella, I won't say the club, but like to a local club, and like the Dublin nurseries, GAA nurseries, start at 4 and 5. They start very young. But
that's too late to start hurling.
but my experience is, I don't know if that's across the board in clubs, but from my experience is they start them with hurling. And that is, as you say, that can be challenging for some club because they're very small kids, and they will get a belt early on. And even some of them get a little bit freaked out about having to wear a helmet. The first day they come in, they're fitted for a helmet and they're measured for a stick and stuff. And it's easier. They're more comfortable with the ball because, like from probably 2, they've been kicking a ball around. So, but that is the thinking that you need to start very young. But then you look at Sean O'Halpine, who didn't pick up a hurl till he was 12 and he did all right. So,
You ever seen a hurler's hands though?
yeah.
It's not the best advertisement. You won't want to show your 7-year-olds that image
No.
and say, this could be you one day.
Probably not. There's be a fair few war wounds there, all right, that's for sure. Look, I suppose one of the big issues I would have with the whole thing, and it works both ways, by the way, it's not just me saying that, predominantly football clubs don't want hurling coming anywhere near them. My own club would be a hurling club that would play a small bit of junior C football, would be the extent of it. But we would have produced a dual county player over the last couple of years at underage level and minor and 20s. I think now he's been a dual player at both. And there would be that a hell of a lot of people who would have that angle within our club. Why did we ever let him near the football? Or, could we not have stopped him going near the football? I don't know if it's going to be full concentration on his hurling now, and he's such a fantastic young hurler. Do we need football in his head? That. Whereas, my God, if we've got somebody who's able to represent our county at 2 codes, should we not be shouting from the rooftops that this is fantastic?
There is coverage of Jarlath Burns's prospective presidency across all the papers, and we can talk any specifics you want, Kieran, but certainly there's the question or like the pieces are almost, well, he's going to be a very significant president. It's just a case of how transformative, like what this great legacy, and you wish him very well, and he's certainly a very interesting figure, and very impressive figure. But my sense is, has the presidency changed overnight without me realising?
Like a lot of it, the pieces, like Shane McGrath in the Mail, Michael Foley in the Sunday Times did a profile in the Sunday Business Post as well. I can't remember who did it, sorry for not crediting
I'll dig it out.
Yeah. But a lot of it focuses around this talk about a border poll and, United Ireland and being open to people of a unionist persuasion and be open to the Protestant community in the north of Ireland. But I first, probably about 2001 or 2000, I interviewed Jarlath Burns about his interest in becoming GAA president, and he was in his mid 30s then, and he was also in Sinn Féin. Like, he talked a bit about that, and like this was only a couple of years after the Good Friday Agreement. It was only 7 or 8 years after the IRA ceasefire. And, back then it was seen as more problematic that he had links. Like, I don't know if he's any connection to Sinn Féin now, but it was seen as more problematic in trying to become, to fulfill the ambitions he had within the GAA. But obviously the Sinn Féin have made a lot of progress on a lot of areas since then. So it definitely wouldn't have the negative connotations it had back then. But I think he is an impressive character. I think he struck a lot of the notes. But to me, and I know people will argue with this, but I still think it's more of a ceremonial role.
Well, I mean, how could anyone argue with that? Yeah,
like the real power lies with the likes of Tom Ryan, the Director General, Peter McKenna, the Croke Park Stadium Director. And you will have people saying, he could be the most impactful president since Sean Kelly, and Sean Kelly had a great achievement opening up Croke Park. I don't think that was down to Sean Kelly, genuinely. Like, it came down to a Congress vote, and sure, Sean Kelly made it clear which way he wanted it to go, but I don't know how much of an impact that had. And I honestly think that with Lansdowne Road closed, I think the GAA as a body and as across its membership and as membership being represented by the Congress delegates, felt it was a neighbourly thing to do to open up then. I don't think it was down to any great leadership. And I don't really know there was a lot of positive stuff ahead of Larry McCarthy's election as well. After his election, that he was the first overseas president, he was going to have a huge impact now. And now people are saying, he's been very quiet, we haven't heard much of him. But I think that's a role. Like, Shane McGrath mentions here that, Larry McCarthy, didn't really take a stand on the story, on whether Glenn Kilmacud Crokes football finals should be replayed. But should the GAA president be taking a stand on things like that? Like, to me, you're head of state, basically.
Yeah.
It's like when Michael D. Higgins says too much, people say he's stepping out of line. He shouldn't be doing that. And I have a feeling the GAA role is a bit similar.
Michael Foley, I thought it's really interesting to read. So Jarlath Burns, and he did it last week when his campaign proved successful, talked about his great hope for a united Ireland. And Michael teases that out here in the piece, and he says the first question that leapt out to him was whether the GAA will need to take a position at all in the short term. And he mentions, for instance, there was a cross-border poll in the Irish Times last autumn. Half the respondents in Northern Ireland would vote against unity, but 21% of those against unity were Catholics. On top of that, only 54% of Northern Catholics polled said they would vote in favour. So Michael's point is what those numbers reflect was how personal any decision about Irish unity will be for every citizen, which provokes the question whether a sports organisation of the GAA's size and scope should take an active public position. Can the GAA speak for all its members is the very obvious point. And he charts the genesis of the GAA, and it was very much about nationalism and a united Ireland. And then it's kind of where are we now? And Michael says most GAA members might support the idea of united Ireland, but it's not why they joined the GAA. And he says whatever insecurities the GAA felt in a different era about the erosion of their core reason to exist, he's talking about the ban there on foreign games, everything has moved on since, including the GAA's identity. And he mentions, the opening of Croke Park and its relationship with other sports. Does the GAA, the modern GAA, really have a role in expressing a definite policy on behalf of his members? He writes, and he says, over the past 30 years, the GAA's inherent identity has transformed radically. All the old bans are gone. The grounds have been opened to other sports. The role of the GAA itself across the country has grown beyond its games. It's become a crucial support hub for every community in all sorts of ways. That evolution aligns with the best characteristics of the GAA's ethos, to be open and to be welcoming and to act as a social glue to bind communities together.
Yeah.
And its apolitical stance has always come under severe pressure down the years, but as an organisation they've always sought to stand apart from the most significant moments in Irish history, the 16 Rising, the Civil War, the tortures of supporting their members during the Troubles, etc. So he concludes by saying groups like Gaels Together and others within the GAA family are perfectly entitled to campaign for unity as they see fit. But the GAA itself, the past 3 decades have amplified the eternal truth that the games themselves and the goodness of the people involved are the GAA's most potent tool when promoting unity of all kinds. And that's what Michael says. That's where the focus should stay.
Yeah.
So it's interesting of Burns's comments. They were like, oh, this is interesting. And oh, God, that is significant, President GAA. And a lot of people I would have thought were like, yeah, brilliant.
Yeah,
It's interesting for Michael to say, well, hang on here. Nationalism is not the reason most of us are involved in GAA. It's not the reason I got involved in GAA.
No.
Yep.
So do we just want to just plough on, just because Jarlath Burns is very much of that mind?
Yeah.
Do we all
Again,
just want to say, yeah, we're all about unity now?
No, it's a brilliantly written piece. He puts his point across fantastic. And maybe I'm saying that because I just agree with the way he's making his point so much. And look, it's probably why I struggle with the concept of politics by and large. Fianna Fáil say this, and I support Fianna Fáil, so therefore that's how I think. The same applies here. Like you said earlier, the GAA is arguably the greatest sports organisation in the world. I agree with you 100%. But because of that, am I therefore going to make my view the GAA's view? GAA says this or Jarlath Burns says this, so well actually okay, I had been thinking a different way, but now that's the way I'm going to think on things? Absolutely not. Kind of, for want of a better way of putting it, stay in your lane to a certain extent,
Because he said last week every civic organisation should have a stance on unity. I was kind of I don't know if the Scouts need to.
Absolutely not.
I don't
Absolutely
know.
not.
And also, and that's getting away from how complex it is for people. In that, you go back to the Irish Times poll that Michael Foley references there, that only 54% of Northern Catholics would vote in favour of United Ireland. A lot of people might wonder why that is. That would be, they would have presumed that was always aspiration. But You have to look where a lot of people work. Like if there is a United Ireland, a lot of people work in the civil service, and the civil service covers so many different branches. For between policing, health, education, social welfare, everything. If you have a 32 county civil service, that the 6 counties are brought in under the umbrella civil service, it's very likely a lot of jobs would be cut. Because positions would have been duplicated all over the place. So I think a lot of people are wary of the change. And also things get very emotive. Like, do you remember a few years ago on the Sunday game, or else it was League Sunday, Sean Cavanagh made a reference to the UK.
Yeah.
But it was a reference in terms of, the tax, it's a different tax jurisdiction or different, I can't remember the exact context.
He's talking very black and white.
Yeah, but what he said was perfectly reasonable because it is, the north of Ireland does operate under UK rules and UK currency, etc.
Yeah.
But he was vilified for it. So some people aren't very reasonable when it comes to these debates. And Jarlath Burns is a reasonable person, but it's not reasonable to accept, as you say, everybody to take a stance on this because it's very, very complicated. And it's tricky if you go public in a stance, I think.
It certainly would politicise the GAA in a way it hasn't been politicised in a very long time.
Yeah, and also if the GAA come out and say, we want a United Ireland, this is our stance, and we end up with a United Ireland, a lot of people who voted against it might feel even more alienated from the GAA than they did before and might feel this body doesn't have time for us. So I think you have to tread carefully.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how Jarlath Burns proceeds. I know that he'll read that piece and think about it because he's very progressive in the sense that he was one of the first people I ever remember of certainly his profile saying, well, do we need to have the national anthem at games? Do we need to have the flag at games?
Yeah.
When you say he's reasonable, he is reasonable in the extreme.
Yeah.
I'm sure he would be willing to make a hell of a lot of concessions in the hope of United Ireland, whereas many who want United Ireland with no concessions on their behalf.
Well, that's going to go well. Fellas, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Shane Keegan, Cobh Ramblers manager, Kieran Cunningham, Chief Sportswriter with the Irish Daily Star. That is the Sunday papers done. We'll come back at you next week. Thank you.
Stuff, man.